Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Webinar Wednesday with Dutch. Today's webinar is going to be Foundational Lecture Series, the Functional Endocrinology Laboratory Test. My name is Amy Paoletti, and I'm a member of the Dutch Education and Marketing team, and I'd like to thank you for taking the time to be with us today. We're excited to have you here. It's our first webinar of 2021. Just a few housekeeping items before Mark starts. I want to let everybody know that we'll try to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. We may actually stop right before we get to case studies and cover some questions if necessary. Otherwise, we'll go on to case studies and try to pick up a few questions at the end. Please feel free to send your questions through the question chat section on the side panel of your screen. Additionally, I want to just mention, and I may mention this a few times through chat, we will send the on-demand recording to all of you tomorrow afternoon, along with the presentation slides. So if you're not able to be with us the entire hour and 10 minutes or so, don't worry, we'll send that recording out to you. So most of you probably who are on the webinar today might be familiar with Mark Newman, but in case you're not, Mark is the founder and president of Precision Analytical, the creators of the Dutch test. He's a recognized expert and international speaker in the field of hormone testing. Mark has spent nearly 20 years within the specialty laboratory arena, developing and directing 24-hour urine hormone testing, organic acid testing, and salivary hormone testing. His unique experience led to a vision for a revolutionary way to test hormones, and thus the inception of a dried urine test for comprehensive hormones. In case all of you were wondering what Dutch stands for, dried urine test for comprehensive hormones. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Amy. Glad to be here and chatting hormones today. We're going to cover, I think, a lot of ground today. This is not all going to be about Dutch. We're going to try to arm you with some tools to use urine testing, saliva testing, serum testing, as you just navigate the lab testing part of it, part of your practice. Do know that for me, I'm not a clinician, so I've been, digging into lab testing and the best ways to do that for 20 years. But the how do I treat my patient part of it's not my expertise, so we won't get as far into those questions. We have other experts that are much better at that side of the question. So let's get started. Functional endocrinology laboratory testing. So we've actually got pretty complex subject matter, but pretty simple questions. So how do we monitor hormones in common situations, which is just broken down into cortisol and reproductive hormones. We definitely are going to see that you're going to want to separate those intellectually in terms of figuring out how do I best test the adrenal side and then the reproductive side, and that's what Dutch is a lot about, is sort of bringing those together. But we're going to talk about blood, saliva, and urine. So let's just remember how this all works. So whether you're talking about an ovary or a testicle, maybe it makes a hormone, then what happens? The hormone's not circulating free, right? It's going to be on a binding protein, so something like SHBG. And when you draw up some blood, which I actually just had done this morning, you're going to find those total hormones as they're bound to their binding protein. When you're talking about the free hormone, that's what's able to get into the cell and do something, right? So that's pretty relevant, and that's the fraction that you're going to typically be measuring in saliva. And that's also true when we're talking about cortisol as it relates to urine. So cortisol is water soluble enough to find its way into the urine. Now, when we're talking about all the other hormones like testosterone,
Hey, Mark.
Estrogen, yeah.
Mark, I'm going to pop in there. Your slides have disappeared. Everybody's seeing you only and no slides. Do you know what you might have done with your view?
Well, lucky you guys. Okay, let me see here. Did I hit the button to not turn off my camera?
There you go. Yeah, you had your slides are back up, but not in presenter view.
Oh, that's funny. Okay, well, let's start over right here.
All
Glad
right.
you said something.
There you go.
All right.
Thank you.
Ovary, hormone, binding protein. That's what we find in blood, right? When you draw blood. Sorry about that. Push the wrong button there. And the point that we're getting at here is that these measurements, these three measurements, are different, right? So when you move from blood to saliva testing, we should be able to get, similar information, but it's a different measurement, right? So there's the free hormone sliding into saliva because saliva will sort of accept that free hormone. And when you're talking about urine testing, urine will accept cortisol because it's water soluble enough. But when we're talking about the steroid hormones like testosterone and estrogen, when they try to slide into urine, they can't because they're not water soluble enough. So what do? That bioavailable fraction hitches a ride to the liver, gets a sugar molecule thrown on it, like a glucuronide, or it could be a sulfate. So now it's a polar version of that molecule, and that's what you find in urine testing for things like estrogen, testosterone. Okay, so we're looking at different forms of hormones. So if you have someone who's severely deficient, someone who's normal, someone who's elevated, you should be able to pick those up in any of the tests, but we are looking at different forms. So there's always a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison when we're moving from one type of test to the other. And I will just point out while we're staring at this depiction of this, that the fact that we're measuring the binding protein here that's bound to the binding protein, that's why when we talk about serum testing, we'll talk about it being a good idea to also measure the binding protein, because then you can get a better idea of how much of that hormone is bioavailable and free. So you're going to have choices to make in your practice. And of course, if you choose poorly, then we know the BHRT is going to go awry and you're going to have a bad experience like this gentleman from Indiana Jones. So we want to be able to choose appropriately, but it's good to know that it's not about choosing for your entire practice, right? Am I a serum tester, a saliva tester, a urine tester? The idea is to know when to leverage each of them. And this is my general mantra for testing generally, that our default starts with serum, cortisol drives us to saliva, and comprehensiveness drives us to urine. And I think if you think on that, and as you watch your way through my lecture, that's definitely what I've something that I hold to when I'm looking at hormone testing. So when we look at male hormones, here are some of the things that we're going to test in serum that end up being a nice complement to what we might look at in urine. It actually might be better said the other way, that the urine test is going to be a complement to some of these foundational tests, right? We're never going to go away from CMPs and CBCs, and thyroid being an example of something that, over time, thyroid's been tested in saliva, blood spot, serum, and urine. And there's just no reason to go away from serum unless you're compelled to do so, right? Like thyroid testing is most comprehensive in blood. It's going to be the most accurate in blood. So we would encourage you to run a comprehensive thyroid panel and to use Dutch as a complement to that. Now, the things you'll see at the bottom here, and as we move on to female health, is some of these hormones at the bottom are going to be optional in blood, because if you're doing something like a Dutch test, you're going to have a representation of those in the urine testing, but you're going to want to complement that with standard blood testing. And I'll be honest with you, I've spent my entire career really focused on reproductive and adrenal hormones. When you start talking about things like prolactin or ferritin, I really don't have a depth of knowledge on those things, but just to know that those are things that are going to be part of your overall interpretation as you're looking at both female and male health. While we're here, we should note that if you're looking at LH and FSH in blood, those are best to do in that follicular phase, typically on day 3. But we move back to the subject matter, which is reproductive and adrenal hormones. Functional medicine sort of started here with, this what I can consider sort of the big 5 of the reproductive and adrenal hormones for us to measure, looking at them in blood. Now, one drawback to be aware of in blood is when you're looking at like progesterone, you'll notice that in this published data, this patient, this I think is more extreme than what you see in a typical patient, but it does show that, throughout the course of the day, this is bouncing around quite a lot. And that's one thing that's nice about a urine test is it's going to grab these ups and downs over the course of the day and average those out. So that is one drawback, but generally serum and saliva testing are going to give you a pretty good value on progesterone. One of the reasons I like a urine test like ours or serum for progesterone is one thing you'll notice here. Here's a female's results. So for our reference ranges, This is the luteal range for premenopausal, and then the postmenopausal range is down here. Now, what you notice for this woman, she's in the postmenopausal range for estrogen, right? But if you zoom in on one of these progesterone metabolites, you notice something here, and this is just a kind of a little nugget on progesterone, is we're expecting a non-cycling woman to be down in here. She's even lower than that, right? She's less than half of what it takes to get into that range. So where is progesterone coming from if not from your ovaries? Well, it's coming from adrenals. So this was, in this particular case, we said, you know, that's so low that she might have an adrenal problem. And then when we tested her adrenals, we saw, oh, you know what? She's actually on a medication that's suppressing her adrenal hormones. And that's one thing I like about a urine test is we can really get down, it's a sensitive assay. So you can not only see, you know, is she ovulating, but you can even see, does she have normal levels for a non-ovulating woman? And here's a paper here that shows that as stress goes and cortisol goes, progesterone does as well in terms of the adrenal contribution. So when you're looking at progesterone and it's low, think about the ovaries. When it's super, super low, then you might even need to think of adrenal health if you haven't already checked the adrenals. So speaking of cortisol, what do we know about cortisol? We kind of started off way back when looking mostly at serum testing, but we really don't find that a lot in functional medicine. But let me just show you why, so we all understand that. Why don't we use serum for total cortisol? You've got to measure cortisol as free cortisol. Here's why. Here's a depiction of this. This is cortisol in serum, cortisol in saliva, cortisol in urine, right? So total hormone in serum and then free hormone in saliva or urine. So let's just say this represents a woman who's not on birth control, and then we put that woman on birth control. The hormones in the birth control will do what? They will increase the binding protein, and then your body will adjust, and you end up with this situation. So the saliva and the urine, or the free cortisol, is a response of what? The stress response. And in this case, if the stress response hasn't changed at all, the serum is still going up because of something that has nothing to do with your actual cortisol status. So this paper that you see here, if you read that paper, it's a really nice description of birth control pushing the serum cortisol around without a change in the stress response. Now, that's just one example of something that can change your total cortisol that isn't seen in your free cortisol. All that to say, the literature is pretty clear. There's not a lot of dispute in our industry that you want to measure free cortisol to get a good idea of how that stress response looks. So we not only want to see it once, we want to see it throughout the day, right? We want the diurnal pattern of free cortisol. The gold standard for that is saliva, and dried urine has become a viable option to also measure diurnal free cortisol. So functional medicine with respect to these hormones has evolved from serum to serum with saliva to look at the cortisol pattern. And then we just recently published this data that says basically, if your old school saliva testing would get one measurement in the early morning, sometime in this period, right? And then throughout the day. And when you look at this change in hormone throughout time, the diurnal pattern, there's an equivalence between what we got in saliva and what we get in urine. And we published that data recently, which allows us to use this as an option, dried urine. Now, why do we want to do that? Because we can add to it, right? We can add estrogen metabolites, phase 1, methylation. We can add androgen metabolites like DHT, cortisol metabolites, B6, B12, glutathione deficiency markers, melatonin, oxidative stress. That's where the Dutch Complete came from, is saying, look, if we can have something equivalent to what you're seeing in a serum saliva combination, but we can add all these other things in, that's a nice option for a tool for you to have in your toolbox. But then science evolves, right? And the literature tells us that saliva has something unique to offer, and that's the cortisol awakening response. So there's a unique value of saliva, the CAR, the cortisol awakening response. So what is that? It's a change between waking and 30 minutes later. So if you were to go and be stressed in a really obvious way, so bear chasing you in the woods type of a thing, right? You're gonna get a response in your cortisol. Now, wouldn't it be nice to be able to mimic that in a way that's controlled? Well, you can. The act of waking up does the same thing to your biochemistry. So if you test within the first 5 minutes of waking and 30 minutes later, not the individual values, those are interesting, but the gap itself is an independent measure of HPA axis function that the literature has been telling us for a while now is really a pretty important measurement. So let me show you a couple examples of where this added information is nice to have. So on the left here, you have urine panels from people who have pretty low profile, right? So you're wanting them up in here, and they aren't, right? They look the same though, that's the point. Then when we look at the same people on the same day, we see that the cortisol awakening response allows us to look a little closer, right? So these 3 points early in the morning represent this same time period that the second urine sample represents. So it's a slightly different representation of the diurnal pattern, but they're basically the same for the diurnal pattern. But what you're noticing here is that if we just look at this case in terms of the cortisol awakening response, when we think of HPA axis resiliency, the top patient and the bottom patient are differentiated some. The one on the bottom has got a little bit more resilience. Now, yeah, it's still low and there's still an issue there, but the degree to which they have a problem on the low end is magnified in that top case, and you're going to want to treat them potentially a little bit differently. Now, what are we using this information for? So traditional medicine is differentiating here. Does this patient have Addison's? No. Do they have Cushing's? Clearly not. Okay, they're normal, and then we can move on, right? Functional medicine says no, we want to dig deeper, right? Because we know that a pretty decent percentage of the population has a cortisol that is nowhere near Addison's and nowhere near Cushing's. They don't have a tumor, right? But they have dysfunction that's leading to something other than wellness, right? And we want to know where on this spectrum of low cortisol to high cortisol, or maybe normal, they might find themselves. So let's look at the other end of the spectrum. Here we have, again, 2 urine panels, and you could call these people twins as it relates to their stress response as we see it in the urine or in an old school saliva. But when we look at the cortisol awakening response, what do we see? Is that the fine tuning of this says that the gap between 0 and 30 minutes is a little bit exaggerated, right? So all of those points are within the reference range, but the gap itself is higher than expected, which means your stress response is a little bit exaggerated. So we're going to say, okay, that the person on the top may be here, but that other person is up in this high cortisol range where we might expect them to develop major depressive disorder because they have an exaggerated stress response. So there are lifestyle and other types of interventions that you might want to seek out. But the question for me is, how do we well define them in terms of how they're functioning with respect to their HPA axis? And looking at that cortisol awakening response gives us the most information on their stress response. Now, if you want to see someone who's even higher, you see someone like this. You say, okay, I've got the urine on the left, the saliva on the right. So what we do with our testing is we add those up. So that's the total, right? And then we have the total of the metabolites. Now, in this case, it doesn't matter what test you do, right? This person's on fire. They were, I know this case, they were inflamed and really, really stressed. And no matter how you slice it, they're really high on that spectrum, right? And so we look at the free hormone, we look at the metabolites. And you might ask yourself, well, why do we care about the metabolites? In this case, all the metabolites do is confirm that, yeah, this person's on fire and they've got tons of cortisol, right? So the most comprehensive way we can look at that, look at the HPA axis, is with the Dutch Plus. It's the dried urine to give you all this stuff we look at in the Dutch Complete, but salivary collections using cotton swabs to make it nice and easy to look at both the diurnal pattern and the cortisol awakening response. But why do we want to look at the metabolites? So there's a unique value that you can only find in urine for cortisol in the metabolites because it's the best marker for overall production. Free cortisol is really, really important, right? That's how you figure out what's going on with someone's stress response, with their diurnal pattern. But it's only about 1% of the total. So if you really want to know how much someone's making, glandular output, look at the metabolites. So let me show you a couple examples. So this is urine free cortisol. You can see they're both a little low. The total's a little low. They're a little different, right? But look what happens when you add in the metabolites, right? These cases are hugely different from each other, right? The case on the top is someone taking prednisone. You take prednisone, it shuts the whole system down. What happens at the bottom? More of a nuanced case, right? This is a case where somebody's actually overdosed on thyroid. So the provider tests them high free T3, high T4, and low TSH. So if we just looked at free cortisol, we'd really miss the bigger picture here, right? So what's going on here? Their production of cortisol is high, that's what the metabolites tell us, but the available free cortisol is low. Well, why is that? Well, that can be a couple different reasons. One of them can be hyperthyroidism. Look how strong the relationship is between thyroid status and the metabolites of cortisol. You metabolize your cortisol more readily as your thyroid increases, right? So watch what happened to this patient. Okay, the doctor said, bummer, I overdid it on the thyroid, sorry, let's cut your dose and then retest you, right? So in the top, you see hyperthyroidism, which isn't really allowing their HPA axis to function properly. Then on the bottom, you can see, what did we do? We fixed the thyroid, and now we have a normal, sort of, HPA axis, normal for them, which still needs some work, right? So this person's HPA axis is actually working in overdrive, and if the only window you had into that is this, you're way off, right? So cortisol is a three-dimensional picture. What's going on with the stress response? What's my total production? And that's why we really like to look at free cortisol along with the metabolites. Let me show you another example of the same picture, but for a very different reason. Okay, free cortisol. What do you notice about these? They're about the same, right? But if you're going to split hairs, you might say the patient on the top is making more cortisol than the patient on the bottom. Maybe. Let's look at the metabolites. Low. Okay, so the metabolites have done what here? They've confirmed that you're not making much cortisol. Well, actually, turns out this patient ended up having congenital adrenal hyperplasia. They have a genetic problem making cortisol. The results make sense. In the bottom case, what looked like someone who had slightly lower cortisol, well, no, they have slightly lower free cortisol, right? But literally, this woman is making more cortisol than 99% of the population, right? Yet her stress response is not really looking that great. Why? In this case, obesity, right? So there's a relationship between obesity and cortisol production, but you don't see it in the free cortisol. Right, so as you look on the left here, and this is data that we're about to submit for publication, as you go from smaller to heavier, you get a lot more cortisol, right? You've got all this adipose tissue. It loves to suck up hormone. The cortisol somehow gets metabolized and excreted in the toilet as a metabolite, so your adrenal gland's pumping out tons of cortisol. But what's circulating, what's in your brain as you go from skinny to bigger, is not actually different when you look at a large set of data, right? So given all of that, the highest we can get in terms of just the amount of information to really make good decisions for cortisol is the Dutch Plus, to look at saliva with the cortisol awakening response and then the dried urine. The Dutch Complete is going to be all of that, but it's missing the CAR. And then if you look at just a saliva panel, you can see the cortisol awakening response, but you're missing the metabolites, right? And then you've got some other options that aren't going to give you very much information. And if you wanted to argue that I love the CAR, the cortisol awakening response, so much, maybe you put that second on the list and you give up the metabolites, that's fine. But these are your choices, and that's how I would rank them in terms of getting good information on cortisol. Okay, so the Dutch Complete, Dutch Plus give you really full pictures of what's going on with cortisol. What about the androgen metabolites? Why are they important? So we can look at testosterone or DHEA in either serum, urine, or saliva. One of the advantages of urine is you get to see these downstream metabolites. So I can see here that and this is a new report format that we haven't yet released yet, but it's fairly similar to how the report works now. We've just added these age ranges right to the gauge, but this person's making lots of DHEA. How do we know? We add all of these up, and there's a lot of them, right? So the bucket at the end of the day that's catching all the DHEA says, wow, you make a lot of DHEA. Now, what if we compare these two? One of the things we can see with androgen metabolites is we can see 5-alpha reductase. So on the right, you have the same total amount of DHEA, but when you look at the balance between alpha here versus beta, alpha, think androgenic. When testosterone goes down the alpha pathway, it makes DHT, it's 3 times as potent. That's true of all the androgens. When they go down the alpha pathway, you're going to get more high androgen symptoms. That's information you can leverage. We'll look at that a little later in some case studies, but that's an advantage to looking at a urine test. Now, just quickly as it relates to DHEA, you've got blood, you've got saliva, you've got urine. Any of those are going to be a reasonable way to look at DHEA. Certainly the gold standard for DHEAS is going to be blood. Saliva is an option. I prefer DHEA in saliva because if you chew on something, DHEAS is actually flow dependent, which is a little bit of a problem, but you can work around it. With urine, I think DHEAS is a more solid measurement in blood. It's a viable option in urine, but then you get the added value of the metabolites. So I think you can go any way with DHEA and get some good information to make decisions. I think that one's a little bit more of a personal preference thing. Okay, so as you look at this, you might ask yourself, okay, so I've got serum for the hormones, saliva for cortisol. I'm kind of looking for comprehensiveness. Why not just use saliva for estradiol and testosterone? Because if you can add all those other hormones into saliva, then you've got a kind of a moderately comprehensive panel that'd be pretty easy to do. So here's why we don't promote that, is because testosterone and estradiol are just better on the other tests. So for testosterone, I think serum is the top of the food chain, especially with men. I really want a serum testosterone, both total and free. We want to test in the morning. When you get down to women, here's where the lab guy in me says you got to be careful about the method. Right? So if you're looking at serum for testosterone, you want to look at LCMS. So as opposed to an immunoassay or an ELISA-based test. So look at these two methods. So call the x-axis your gold standard, okay? And the y, just call that a cheaper test, right? That's going to be less expensive, easier to do, and they correlate pretty well, right? Pretty nice correlation. But look what happens when you zoom in on the low level. That's postmenopausal for estradiol, and that's female for testosterone. The cheaper, easier test starts to fall apart. That's where we need LCMS. And this is the issue that I have with saliva testing, is it's way down here using that same type of technology that we're moving away from in blood testing. So sex hormones in saliva, are they accurate? Yeah, I think so conceptually. Like what's in your saliva matters, but it's a really challenging thing analytically. So for serum, I like serum the best, urine because it has the metabolites, and saliva. And you could flip those around and go with the saliva assay. Those have their pros and cons. And we could discuss that in length. I'm not going to do that right here. But again, I think especially for male health, you want to have a serum testosterone. And the reason I lead with that is I want you to know that when my own test is not first in a category, like I'm going to tell you that, because then hopefully you'll be a little bit more okay and knowing that I'm being at least as objective as I can when we get to the estrogen and say that I really like a urine test for estrogen, because you get a really good handle on estradiol and you get the metabolites. Now, serum should work fine too. You're going to want to add SHBG so you can get a calculation of free. And again, we just showed that data. You want the LCMS assay. Okay, now when do you want to test for sex hormones? In a woman, this is, we'll get into cycle mapping later. This is a cycle mapping test. So you can see what's normal is between these black lines, right? So this plateau right there at 19 to 22, that's where we test. You get maximum progesterone and the estrogen's kind of on this nice mid-level plateau. That allows you to test really well. And I will say here, if you see this progesterone down here, this is what someone looks like who's not ovulating, right? And just know you're not going to get interesting progesterone results. They'll look just like this all month if a patient's on birth control, right? Because you're telling the brain, like, we don't need to ovulate. We're going to shut that down. So just know that. You're not going to get interesting progesterone. It will be predictable if you're on most birth control. So for estrogen, Dutch, serum, LCMS, and then your cheaper standard serum test isn't going to be as good. And then I think saliva ranks last in this category. But I'll show you a really practical way that I like to gauge this. What happens when we develop a test for estradiol? We test a bunch of premenopausal women and we set a reference range, right? Test a bunch of postmenopausal women, get a reference range. And then we say, okay, this thing is ready for sale. So you can test your patient and see if they are where. Oh, this patient's high. This patient's normal for a premenopausal woman. Here's a patient who's severely estrogen deficient. And this is the patient I want to focus on. This is a patient who has lower levels than a typical premenopausal woman, but higher levels than a postmenopausal woman. But you have to be able to differentiate well to get that. So if you go to a test of lesser quality, what you're going to find is reference range and a reference range, and they're going to overlap, right? So a tool like this has less differentiating power, right? So if I test a woman up here, I can still say, yeah, you got a lot of estrogen. But this woman here, like, I really don't know who you are if my test can't differentiate between the truly hormone deficient and the hormone sufficient. And if you have a test that's really not sensitive, and you'll see some of these on the market where the postmenopausal and the premenopausal range are pretty much the same, that is not a tool we can use in our practice, right? Let me show you a specific example of this. LabCorp, good lab, right? Draw some blood, get a serum test. The standard serum assay, here are the ranges. Premenopausal, 44 up, postmenopausal, less than 55, right? So that looks like this middle category. There's overlap, right? We would prefer that it is better than that. So go back to the same lab, draw the same blood, and say, give me your ultra-sensitive LCMS assay, and now look at it, right? Those postmenopausal women, they're not up around 55, right? You have an accurate, precise test that is down where they belong. And if a woman's ovaries are making estrogen, she's well separated from that. So the same lab offers, for different price points, moderate quality tests and high quality tests. If you're testing a postmenopausal woman, a man, or a kid, you've got to have that extra sensitive test. So we took a test like that and we compared our Dutch test, right? And we published that data that showed that our test is sensitive like those ultra-sensitive serum assays and provide a really good monitoring tool for both estrogen and progesterone. So just a list of our published validation: estrogen and progesterone correlation to serum, 24-hour urine, liquid versus dried. For cortisol, dried versus liquid, 24-hour correlation, and then the all important for there is saliva versus urine. What's coming next is the validation data for the rest of our panel, but then also some clinical correlation with BMI. So this is almost ready for publication, where we're showing that these cortisol metabolites are much, much bigger when you're getting into people who are in the higher BMI category. So almost have that ready to go. And then some HRT data that I'm really excited to get into print this next year, because we really need to be able to show and prove to you as end users that this is not only quality as it relates to our own evaluation, but to have, you know, peer-reviewed publication of both analytical and clinical validity is a huge thing for us going forward. Now, what is that extra bonus that we get with urine testing? With urine testing and estrogen, if I can get serum equivalents, great. But if I can give you the metabolites, it's such a richer look at the estrogen. So if you look at this woman, this was a woman who was estrogen dominant, but the question is why, right? Look at her estradiol high. Remember, that's the luteal range. She's out of the luteal range, right? Estrone is high. 16-hydroxy-E1 is high normal. The carcinogenic 4-hydroxy is high. What is the only one that's below the middle of the normal range for her? 2-hydroxylation, right? So we know that drain is sort of plugged for her, right? So why she's estrogen dominant is not because she's making too much estrogen, but she's really not processing it well. And luckily, functional medicine providers have good tools like DIM that can open that channel up. And I'll show you what those results looked like after she got on some supplementation to help to balance that. But what are we measuring? 2-hydroxyestrogens, which are thought to be more protective, 4-hydroxyestrogens, which have a carcinogenic mechanism by which they can damage DNA, and those are going to be higher in people that are going to develop breast cancer. And then your 16-hydroxy-E1, which is a more potent estrogen metabolite, and we've got to be careful with the interpretation of that one, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail when we get to the case studies there at the end. Now, phase 2, methylation, we want to see that too, right? So on the Dutch panel, we're looking at 2-hydroxy getting converted to 2-methoxy. So what we observe is that average this is about half, right? So if I have 15, I'm expecting somewhere between 7 and 8. I have almost 10, so that's pretty decent methylation, right? That person's methylating it well. And that's going to be protective, but especially as it relates to how your body gets rid of the 4-hydroxyestrogen. And the way that we monitor that is to look at how well you convert 2-hydroxy to 2-methoxy. So for me, for example, I have a COMT SNP. So COMT for me is genetically mutated. I'm not good at it, and my methylation always stinks on a Dutch panel. So there are things I can do about that. And it's good for you to understand that about your patient as you're looking at the estrogen profile. Let's go back to this woman, before and after DIM. So again, we made the observation that, hey, she's not metabolizing well down this pathway, and it's causing these parent estrogens to be high. So look how well balanced she looked after taking DIM for an entire cycle and then retesting, right? That's the power of the metabolites. And one of the reasons that people like to look at this is it's thought that the more you favor the 4, and to some degree favor the 16, which is more estrogenic, and the more you don't favor the 2-hydroxylation, then that may be problematic in terms of breast cancer risk. Now, one of the nice things about urine testing is you can expand that further. Notice some of these observations. In breast cancer cases, higher oxidative stress, higher 8-hydroxy-deoxyguanosine, lower levels of melatonin in people that develop breast cancer. That in that paper, they're measuring the same marker that we measure on the waking sample, right? I want to know how much melatonin you made at night. Wake up, give me a urine sample, measure the 6-hydroxy melatonin sulfate, and guess what? They're lower in people who get breast cancer. So there's some associations there. If you have a flattened cortisol curve, that's not good, particularly if you already have breast cancer. So estrogen and metabolites and progesterone, there are a number of touch points that we can see with, again, what I said was at the beginning is comprehensiveness is what drives us to urine. So as you're dealing with clinical cases that are complex, having a window into these number of different markers can be really helpful. Now, that's just testing one day, right? I test a series of urine, saliva samples, or blood sample, and you get to look at those hormones over one day. Now, what do you do with a woman who has a highly irregular cycle? What do you do with a woman who's had an ablation? So she cycles, but she doesn't bleed. So you have no idea like when to test her, right? Or someone who's got a fertility or PMS is, let's look at a cycle now, right? So one day test focuses here. And that's, if you look at these two cases actually, and I said, okay, test them on day 20. What'd you get? And then I say, okay, guess what the rest of the profile looks like. In these cases, you'd guess right. What you'd find is that the estrogen is normal. Progesterone is anovulatory in this case. If progesterone is anovulatory, you're going to say, oh, well, she doesn't make any progesterone. Guess what? Right. Okay. And the estrogen is not postmenopausal, right? Ovulation failure is going to be way down here. So she's got normal levels, but they're not cycling right. Right now, in the second case, this is like textbook, right? Remember, the reference ranges are between the two black lines. And look at that, pretty good ovulation, normal on day 20, normal the rest of the cycle, plenty high progesterone, normal, right? So the fact that you tested this woman throughout an entire cycle doesn't add that much information, right? But it gives you more confidence. So in some cases, you might want to do that. Here are a couple cases where I think it's really helpful. So let's look at the case on the right. This patient has textbook estrogen, right? So the cycle mapping is just confirming that, yeah, you've got a nice ovulatory peak, you've got normal estrogen, good for you. Now, when I get to the progesterone, if you told me that this woman is in perfect shape, like no PMS, no fertility issues, whatever, I might leave that alone. But if you told me this woman's struggling with PMS, she's struggling with infertility, then I'm going to really look at this and say, okay, hold on. Progesterone's getting up high enough, but it's supposed to hang, right? And it doesn't, it dies, right? So her progesterone starts dying early. So yes, she's ovulating, making progesterone, but not that much, it's not hanging on, right? So if I'm trying to have implantation occur, or if she's really like emotionally not doing very well, because look what happened to estrogen. Between these 2 points, estrogen hung out in the same range and the progesterone plummeted. So when you think of the concept of estrogen dominance, this woman's spending the latter part of her cycle estrogen dominant. There's something you can do about that. Cycle mapping helps us to show that, because if you were testing on just one day, you get this nice, pleasant value right there, and you really don't know, right? The woman on the left, real interesting. So look at the estrogen. Overall, it's low, right? I would say, that peak's not very big. We're below the range a lot. So the estrogen's relatively low. And what about progesterone? If progesterone's in right there, it's kind of ambiguous on a one-day test. Like, did she ovulate? Did she not? I'm not really sure, right? But when you look at the cycle map, right, it's so much more just meaningful in terms of the data. Because one of the things you'll find on this patient is, look, her cycle only went 26 days. So you'd expect ovulation over in here, right? But it's here. And when we test on day 19, you're actually in the tail end of the ovulatory peak, which pushes it up into the normal range. So if you tested one day on this patient, you'd go, okay, estrogen's normal, progesterone's low, and I don't know if you're ovulating. Now I can tell you that the ovulatory peak is actually what you're catching on day 20, but we're looking at the whole cycle. So I know that your overall estrogen is actually a little on the low side, right? And yes, you ovulated. That bump right there, right after ovulation, is definitely ovulation, but your progesterone production stinks, right? So that description of that woman is so much more complete than just to say whatever you'd get from her on a one day, whether it's serum or urine. You're getting an incomplete picture on a complex case like that. So when a woman's case is complex and she's cycling, think about the cycle mapping. What we do on those is they collect urine samples almost every day from day 7 through the end of the cycle. For cycles 26 days, we've got plenty of samples. If for cycles 46 days, plenty of samples. And then we take the 9 most relevant measurements to characterize the ovulatory and the luteal peak. Really nice data, and you can get that with all of the Dutch Plus or the Dutch Complete information. So that's a really nice set of data when you're dealing with a premenopausal woman. So we want to get a good handle on the reproductive hormones and the adrenal hormones, put that all together, most of the time complement that with a serum test like a thyroid panel. The thyroid and the adrenals talk. And Amy, if you have any questions, you can kind of prep maybe some that are real relevant now, and then I'll hit some of these case studies, and then we can finish up with the other questions at the end. But there's always going to be, I think, a complement between what you find in urine, in saliva, and in your serum testing, and thyroid and adrenals are going to talk to each other a lot. So we really want to understand that broader picture, and for a premenopausal woman, to add in the cycle mapping data really rounds out some really nice data to have some leverageable points when we're trying to figure out what's going on with a particular patient. So I can move into case studies, or you can hit a few questions now if you want, Amy.
Sure. Let me go ahead and ask you a couple questions, which you may have ended up covering a little bit. These were some early questions. I did have a question, sort of a three-parter. A two-parter from the same attendee. What is the difference between 24-hour free cortisol and metabolized cortisol? And then also ask, what is the difference between cortisone and cortisol? If you want to run through that again.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a good question. So this is a saliva panel we're going to start with on our case studies, but let's just pretend that this is a urine cortisol. Okay, so the total for the day for us correlates to a 24-hour urine cortisol. So that means total day collection, cortisol, but only the free fraction, right? That's only the active fraction that's usually 1 to 2% of the total that's produced. So the total for 24-hour, it's really tempting to say that's total cortisol production. It's not. It's the total daily free cortisol, okay? Then what happens to that free cortisol? It gets metabolized, it gets turned into a metabolite, and it goes into the urine. Most of the cortisol ends up in that form. So when we get these numbers in urine over here are going to be in the dozens, maybe hundreds, right? They're the same units as these metabolites that are up in the thousands, right? So that just happens to be, I just think of it as like, this is the bucket at the end of the day that catches all your cortisol. Right, so when you want to ask the question, how much cortisol did I make today? You don't actually want to measure cortisol. You want to measure all the metabolites, add them up. That's what that number is for us. So it's the best representation of glandular output of cortisol. Now, cortisol is also, let me go over here where I can draw a little bit, is also circulating, right? So cortisol, which actually cortisol is often represented as F. I have no idea why. And then it gets converted to E. which of course means cortisone. I don't understand why. Okay, then cortisone goes back to cortisol. So you have this cycle going on in your body. Adrenal makes cortisol. It gets deactivated in the kidney, liver, colon. Those are the big areas of deactivation, right? Because your kidney is like, hey, cortisol kicks up my blood pressure. So I'm going to move it over to cortisone, which does not, and then it goes back throughout the body. The liver, especially fat cells, will reactivate it to cortisol. So there's this back and forth. So we measure cortisol and cortisone, each measurement throughout the day. We want to know the up and down pattern of cortisol, and the up and down pattern of cortisone tends to parallel it, right? Then there's this additional question we can ask, which is, hey, if my patient is really pushing this way towards cortisone, then it's always in the inactive form, right? And that's not helpful if I'm trying to get more cortisol for a patient, right? And then you might have another patient who's, let's say, inflamed, and they're pushing all their cortisone back to cortisol, and it's staying more in that active form. That's another measurement that's on the Dutch test, which says which form does the cortisol sit in more, active or inactive. And that's not necessarily good or bad, but it's informative, because if you have low cortisol, you may want to favor the active form because you don't have very much. Whereas if you're inflamed and on fire and making all this cortisol, as a protective mechanism, your body's going to push it towards cortisone. That's just part of the picture. So we measure cortisol, we measure cortisone, we measure the metabolites. I want to know the diurnal pattern of cortisol. I want to know the total produced. And then a lot of times I also want to look a little more closely and say, is it sitting in the active or the inactive form more? When you paint that broad of a picture of cortisol, it really gives you a full understanding of what's going on with the cortisol with the patient. So that was the genesis of the Dutch test, is we wanted a more comprehensive cortisol panel. And then it also happens to be comprehensive for sex hormones as well, which is nice. But that was like the main driver for where this test began, 10 years ago. Did I cover all of that, Amy?
Yep, you sure did. So I've got several questions that came in, and I think maybe it's more you kind of providing a position. I've got a lot of questions coming in about birth control or being on any kind of oral contraceptive or IUDs and the Dutch test.
Right.
So if you could cover that a little bit.
Yeah, people often ask, like, well, should I even do the test? Well, I'm going to give you like 30, 40 measurements, right? So if you do it on birth control, what it normally means is that this one value is predictable because you're shutting it down, right? If you're on a progestin of any type, you're probably not ovulating. If you're not ovulating, you're not making progesterone. So you're going to end up in this postmenopausal or non-cycling range for progesterone. And estrogen isn't always suppressed by birth control. So that's interesting. Estrogen metabolism is interesting. And then we've got the androgens and the cortisol and the organic. So the whole panel is still, I think, has a lot of value, but you need to go into it knowing that it's not a way to assess progesterone. And please don't get off of birth control, assess your progesterone, and get back on birth control. Like, that's crazy, right? Because if you're going to stay on birth control, you're telling your body, I'm going to shut down your progesterone this month and next month and the month after that. Then you know what it is. So, and there's no reason to test it, right? But the rest of the test has a lot of value in terms of, again, what's going on with your estrogen, how are you processing it, how do your androgens look, and cortisol and all of that. But just know that you're going to get a predictable progesterone typically when you're on something that has that progestin, that hormone birth control in it. Now, I will say this, every once in a while you get ovulation, you get progesterone, but it still doesn't matter because next month you're probably going to suppress it. I think it suppresses ovulation something like 90-some% of the time, right? So even if you catch a high progesterone on a month when the birth control didn't quite do its job that way, and it has other mechanisms of keeping you from getting pregnant, it's just not interesting information. So if you're on a copper IUD, now your hormones are working like normal, and you should expect a healthy progesterone and all of that. But when you're on a hormone birth control, look at the whole panel, know that progesterone's low. You read the comments on the report, it will say progesterone's low, you're on birth control. That makes sense. That's what you want to communicate to your patient, and you move on. So, but it's important to know that. So, You all want more, or you want me to go through the case studies?
I go ahead and go through the case studies.
Okay, because if I don't, I'm going to draw all over it and won't even be able to see it. So, all right, I've got a couple case studies, and we're thinking more here about how do I interpret this. Okay, I'm not thinking about how do I fix somebody, but how do I interpret this correctly? Because that's really my area of expertise. So we're not going to draw complete pictures of these patients. We want to just talk about what the description would be in this case. So we look at this patient. This is a summary page that shows that the estradiol is where. Estradiol is not in the ovarian failure range, right? But it's also not in the luteal range, right? So that's a modest deficiency for a premenopausal woman. I'm personally not going to freak out about that if the patient doesn't have any symptoms. If she's got symptoms of low estrogen, then maybe that's something we need to address. But you know, she's lower than 80–85% of cycling women, and that might be something that we might want to deal with. But it's not a severe deficiency, right? If she's down at like 0.4, 0.5, now you have ovarian failure potentially, and that's a little bit of a different picture, right? So estrogen's on the low side. In spite of that, she got a nice strong progesterone, which means we know she's ovulating. Pretty strong progesterone. If I want to look at estrogen dominance, this is where I do it. And I say, okay, I've got a tug of war between these two. Who's winning the tug of war? That's honestly as complex as you need to get to look for estrogen dominance on a serum panel or a urine panel. Look at the progesterone, look at the estrogen, and see which one's higher in the reference range, right? So if the progesterone's normal and the estrogen was at like 4.2, that's going to be potentially estrogen dominant, even though both of them are normal, right? Because the estrogen's winning the tug of war. Okay, so I want to look at that there. Testosterone for her is low normal. DHEA is low normal. Now let's remember age-dependent ranges. Even if she's in her 40s and 50s, that's actually low. So it's within the broader range, but she's a little low on her androgens, right? Now this is a Dutch Plus. They actually added the insomnia sample. So the Dutch Plus has a sample you can collect at night. So while she's trying to sleep at 2 a.m., she's got a lot of cortisol. She should be down here, right? Then when she wakes up, flat, right? So she has a flat car. That's not good. She has a flat overall picture for cortisol. So is her stress response working? Yeah, it's functional, but it's not working like it's supposed to. It's high when she's trying to sleep. We definitely would want to check melatonin on a woman like this to see if she's got any of that going on at night. So her HbA axis is significantly off from an ideal pattern here. And if she's got a lot of fatigue, that would not be surprising. That's definitely something we'll want to focus on. The total for that is within normal, and the metabolites are high. Now, if this was an obese patient, you would say, well, that makes a lot of sense. You get a lot of metabolites when you're obese. She's making a lot of cortisol. So we could expand on the interpretation of that depending on the particulars for the patient. Now, I want to look at the testosterone. So she's at 2.5. Let's say she's at 18. Okay, let's say she's got high testosterone. This is where we then want to dig further on a urine panel to say, okay, she doesn't have a lot of DHEA. So she's got a high level of testosterone. She doesn't have high testosterone symptoms. Let's look closer. Okay, so we say, okay, first thing I'm going to look at is the testosterone metabolites to say, well, is she really making a lot of testosterone? I look at those and I go, oh yeah, she is. Okay, so she's making a lot of testosterone. Now this is a different woman's case that I'm moving to, but this is just conceptual. So a woman like this that has a higher testosterone. Now in this case, this is where it's different than what I just showed you. You know, she's got a fair amount of DHEA, fair amount of testosterone. So if you say, well, why doesn't she have high testosterone symptoms? It might be because instead of pushing down the androgenic alpha pathway, she's pushing more down the beta pathway. See how the beta is winning here, the beta is winning here. So it's taken the edge off that testosterone because it's becoming less androgenic as it gets metabolized. Okay, I still probably want to deal with the fact that she's making a lot of DHEA, in this case, a lot of testosterone. Even though she doesn't have symptoms, I might want to look at some of that. Now, what does she look like this instead? Testosterone's high, 18, okay. And everything else on the androgen panel is low, right? So if I look at her testosterone metabolites, they're low, right? There's no real discernible alpha versus beta preference here, but DHEA in this case is low, like really low. and testosterone. It's like, what would you do in a case like this? This is the kind of stuff where we end up on the phone with you guys and going, okay, what do we do with this? Well, she doesn't have high testosterone symptoms. So I would be suspicious of this result, right? In this case, she doesn't have a lot of substrate, right? So testosterone is either coming from her ovaries or from adrenal production of androstenedione and DHEA that moves over to testosterone. So she's got a general deficiency for androgens, but the testosterone is elevated. Maybe she had some sort of transitory elevation in testosterone, and particularly if she doesn't have high testosterone symptoms. Maybe if she's not on a testosterone supplement, that would be good to rule out. You know, and I don't think it's out of line to question the test for testosterone itself. This is why I like urine testing, because when you talk about androgens, right, I've got like 8 things to look at that speaks for the androgens. I'm not hanging my hat on just one value. So in this case, I would look with suspicion, either clinically in what's going on with her or analytically in terms of how we got a high testosterone value there, but it's not confirmed when I look at the rest of the picture, right? And that's worth looking at. It's also worth noting that here's a study where they looked at serum testosterone, and they said serum testosterone wasn't actually that great of a predictor of sexual function. They said the overall androgen levels were, because some of that testosterone is getting made within the cell. So this was an affirmation for looking at the overall family of androgens as it relates to women's testosterone, instead of focusing in on just one value. And so that's important to know. Now, let's say she looked like this. Here's a patient with really heavy 5-alpha dominance, right? This is one of the reasons why we look at women's metabolites, especially, you know, a case like PCOS. What are we asking ourselves? Is she making too much DHEA? Is she making too much testosterone? Is she metabolizing in an androgenic way? In this case, absolutely. So primary is going to be these guys, right? So that one is the one that there's the most literature on that says women who struggle with high androgen symptoms tend to push down the alpha pathway. This woman definitely pushes there, not beta, right? Testosterone also is going down where? Alpha, making lots of DHT. You want to look further? Look at progesterone. Progesterone's not androgenic. That's not the point. The point is it's the same enzymes, right? So that push down this alpha pathway, right? Alpha over beta, right? Look at cortisol metabolism. Now, we don't plot cortisol this way. I just made this up so you could see it. If you look on the cortisol page in this woman, you'll see that her alpha cortisol metabolite is high, and her beta cortisol metabolite, even though it's a higher number because the ranges are different, it leans where? Alpha. So here's a case where there's an alpha sweep, which means that's clear evidence that she is a high 5-alpha person. I'm going to be thinking about insulin. I'm going to be thinking about, gosh, is her hair thinning? Do we need to be, you know, dealing with that? But first off, let's get the interpretation right. And, you know, this stuff isn't magic, right? Like, you're going to find women who happen to be alpha for one of these sets and might lean beta for some of the others. So that's less of a clear 5-alpha dominant situation. So my point here is you're going to be led in the report to looking here and to some degree here. But if you want to get more advanced in the way you understand metabolism patterns, you know, you can look at these other examples to get a clearer, more confident picture of whether that androgen metabolism is really heavy in one direction. Now, if we go back to our case study and you want to look at her actual results on that 2.5 testosterone, they're actually pretty boring. The testosterone metabolites confirm low normal production. Okay, we have a consistent story there. You know, she's a little alpha dominant here, and gosh, that's pretty balanced there, right? So there's not much to see there. She's just low-ish for DHEA and low-ish for testosterone. Now, if you told me this woman was 20, she's pretty low. Like, that's pretty deficient for, you know, a woman that you're expecting to be up in here and up in here, right? So that's how I work my way through it, is look at the parent hormone, look at the metabolites generally, then look for specific metabolism patterns, same way with the estrogens. Okay, now this is our report format that's not out yet, but it's the same information that you're looking at now on a Dutch test. Estrogen metabolism. Start with phase 1. What do we notice for this patient? Well, right off the bat, you're going to say, okay, 4-hydroxyestrogens are bad, and she's elevated for both 4-hydroxy E1 and E2. Okay. The way that we look at that in a more nuanced way is with our pie chart. So this is something that's unique to us, is we say that all 3 of these metabolites matter, 1, 2, 3, and we put them in a pie chart in a 3-way ratio that says basically average is 70% 2-hydroxylation, 10% 4, and 20% 16-hydroxylation. So what is she? She's exactly average, 69 for the 2, which is heavy, the 4, right? Which you can see it clearly here, right? You just look at the results, you can tell she's 4 dominant. But that ratio in that pie chart, when the numbers are not so clear in terms of one being out of range and the other's in range, it's a really nice place to look to see, okay, is her metabolism balanced, and how does that look? Then you move on to methylation, which again is, we talked about this already, is moving hydroxy to methoxy. And again, on ours, it's usually about a 2-to-1 ratio. So she's at 8, so I'm expecting her around 4, but she's at 5 or 6, which means she's a little on the higher side when it comes to methylation. So she methylates well. Now, why is that good? Well, because that's how you get rid of this guy, right? So 4-hydroxy becomes 4-methoxy and it saves the day. If it doesn't, then you get DNA damage, right? And we don't want that. Now, here's a kind of a finer point when it comes to metabolism. What happens when everything's low? Well, 1, we know she's not making very much estrogen, right? But here's a point that might not be immediately obvious. With these really low numbers, you're getting close to the detection limit of an assay, right? So we don't want to overemphasize ratios when you get very low. So I told you methylation is like a 2-for-1 ratio, right? So this is at 0.4. So this should be at 0.2. Oh my gosh, it's half. It's only 0.1. That's more of an approximate relationship when you get down this low. Really what we know from that is just she doesn't have very much of either, right? If this was 4.0 and 2-methoxy was at 1.0, so everything's 10 times higher, that's much more significant because we're not down in the dregs, like looking at the noise of the assay, right? You're getting really close to the detection limit there. So the point is, with these ratios of 2 versus 4 versus 16, when you get really, really low, look at those a little bit more approximate. And then when you get up higher, then you're going to get more precision as it relates to the ratios. Now, when you do get really low, I will say this, is that a lot of focus has been historically on the 2-16 ratio, right? Meaning if we favor the 2, we feel better about breast cancer. If we favor the 16, we feel better about bone because it's estrogenic, right? The thing with 16 is it's potent. It's not as potent as estradiol, but it's way more potent as an estrogen than any of these other metabolites. So you have to put that in context. A woman who has high estrogen and pushes towards 16, it's going to exacerbate her high estrogen symptoms. And in that sense, I would say it's bad, right? But if you look at a woman who has really low estrogen levels and you said, well, she's really low and she's pushing towards 16, you might say, oh, well, low estrogen equals bone issues, right? So if you push towards the 16 with low estrogen and you freak out and give her a boatload of DIM, what's going to happen is all those estrogens are going to come down even further, right? You're going to induce further estrogen deficiency. You're going to pull away from the 16 towards the 2, and she might have a better chance of not getting breast cancer. But her risk for osteoporosis at that point is going to really go up. So the 16 is a potent estrogen. Pay attention to it, but make sure we put it in the proper context. The 4-hydroxyestrogen has no redeeming value. It damages DNA. It's the bad guy, right? So if that one's predominating, then we want to support methylation, support glutathione, and maybe use something to modify estrogen metabolism. So I will end with this one, which is tricky. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a tricky one to end with. So remember, we look at this pie chart, right? And we say the 2-hydroxy is on average around 70. In this case, it's at 60, so that's lower, right? So look at this. 2-hydroxy is at 4. 4-hydroxy is at 0.8, and the 16-hydroxy is at 1.8. So normally you might say, well, these two are a little hot, and the 2-hydroxy is a little low. Okay, and then we go down here and we can look at methylation. So here's that same 2-hydroxy, okay, and we convert it to 2-methoxy. Now, what did we say? This is normally 2 for 1, so this is 4, so I'm expecting 2. And I don't get 3, I get 6, right? Which means a lot of the hormone that's heading down this 2-hydroxy pathway is continuing on very rapidly. This is a person who's methylating like crazy. I would never look like this, okay? But what it means is this pie chart is based on these 3 values, and it doesn't take into consider the methylated estrogen, which is usually a small guy and doesn't influence it that much. In a case like this, that 61% for 2-hydroxylation is a bit of an underestimation because she's so rapidly so rapidly methylating the 2-hydroxy. So that's a little bit of a tricky one, right? We want to look at the absolute levels of these metabolites, then look at the relative level of these metabolites, look at phase 1, look at phase 2, and of course, look at the parent estrogens, right? E1, E2, and then put the whole picture together. And that's, I think, where a lot of the value comes from the urine-based test, is we're getting serum equivalency with estradiol, but then adding this in as well. So is she a poor 2-hydroxylator? Maybe not in this case, right? Because again, so much of that's being pushed further down that pathway. And those are some of the nuances of why we have 10 really terrific doctors on staff that can help talk you through this. The last part of the test is some of these vitamin deficiency markers and other organic acids. So in this particular case, MMA is high, so she may have a B12 deficiency. These are okay, so we're feeling pretty good about B6. And if someone's got bad estrogen metabolism, we want to have good glutathione because it helps to detox that stuff, right? So pyroglutamate gets high when you have a glutathione deficiency. So in this case, supporting with B12 and glutathione is probably not a bad idea. We're getting a window into dopamine and norepinephrine turnover, melatonin, and then our oxidative stress marker. So those tests sort of complement the rest of the hormone panel. So if you have any other questions, Amy, I can take those now. But we really want you as providers, leveraging Dutch where it's useful, but also, being competent to use serum and saliva where they fit in as well. And we don't do any serum testing, but it's a staple of all of your practices, of course, for some markers, and even for the hormones. It can be an important addition. This is more of a basic understanding of hormones, so I didn't have time to go into the testosterone, but the hormones we measure in urine are in a phase 2 metabolite form, right? So the estradiol in that form correlates with serum, but it assumes that you're able to make that conjugated form. And in a fraction of the population, that's not always true for testosterone, which is why testosterone is rated second best compared to serum when it comes to testosterone. So that's a real short conversation on why I think, especially for testosterone, we want to have that serum complement. Usually going to want to have a serum thyroid as well to complement the adrenal portion of that. But for the Dutch itself, easy collection, comprehensive. We touch on HRT in other educational lectures, and if you have questions on that, certainly reach out to us because we have a lot of material on that. That's one of my favorite topics. It's actually hard to do a lecture like this without getting into, because it's so interesting, and we've built Dutch to be as versatile as possible when it comes to HRT. I think one of the things that really sets us apart, you don't find a lot of functional endocrinology or functional lab tests where there's a lot of data in peer review that shows the validity of it both analytically and clinically. So that with that, I will open it back up for a few more questions, Amy, if you've got any, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure, I've got a couple. And I don't know, you might want to get back to maybe the estrogen metabolite page for the case you were showing. So I do have one. It's a two-part question. I'm only going to ask you the one part because it goes a little bit in depth on treatment, but it wanted to know if can dried urine provide quantitative values for E1, E2, and E3?
I'm going to get back out and in so I can get rid of all my highlight drawing all over the place here. Quantitative value. So what our paper showed when we published it is that quantitatively there was statistical equivalence between estradiol as measured in serum by an accurate assay and the estradiol value that we measure in urine. So one of the questions we get a lot is, well, isn't urine a metabolite? So that makes it like different than serum. Like, yeah, it's different in that technically estradiol glucuronide, that form we find in urine, is technically a metabolite, but it's a reflection of bioavailable hormone, because only the bioavailable hormone is available for conjugation that finds its way into urine. But then it's on us to prove to you that it quantitatively correlates to the gold standard, which is what? That's a serum assay, right? A good serum assay. And so we did that because it was critically important that we not let you assume that to be true based on our good word, but we need to show you that it's not only true conceptually in urine, but it's true of our assay. And so that was a really important thing for us to show, which was published, I think, in 2018 or 2019. So
2018.
yes, it's a quantitative assay for estradiol production. And then we go further on this page and show metabolism.
Okay, I've got a question. When you were talking about the hypermethylation of the 2-OH, they're asking, doesn't the 4-OH and the 16-OH also get methylated? And if not, why?
So, okay, so when the 2 and the 4 are cousins, all right? So when you look at the bottom of the molecule of estrogen, you get a hydroxy group here, OH, I'm not gonna draw the whole thing, and you get OH here. That is a super reactive group, right? And that's what gets methylated. The 16-hydroxy is up on the top part of the molecule, though it's a totally different beast. So it doesn't act like a catechol because it's not a catechol. So it doesn't create this free radical and have the need for methylation. Maybe there's some methyl version of 16-hydroxy E1 and estriol. And for everyone's information, estriol is 16-hydroxy E2, right? So those 16-hydroxy estrogens are not methylated in the kind of quantities, if at all, as 2-hydroxy and 4-hydroxy. So the 2-hydroxy, there's quite a bit of it. It makes lots of 2-hydroxy, lots of 2-methoxy, and then we get to measure it for you and say, do you methylate, right? The 4-hydroxy, if you look here, okay, we've got it on the report in schematic form. It gets methylated, but there's not very much of it. And I've seen, gosh, 4 different labs that have commercially offered 4-methoxy and then took it off their report. Why? Because it's so small, it's so noisy that it often creates contradictory information that doesn't necessarily mean you methylate the 4 different than the 2. It's just that the 4 is so much harder to measure. And so we measure 4-methoxy E1 and we do not report it because it is not accurate and precise enough to hang our hat on in terms of asking the question, are you methylating your estrogens well? So yes, it's there. Yes, it's critically important. It's actually at least as important as methylating the 2-hydroxy, but it's so hard to measure that we go with the more robust 2-hydroxylation. And the other option is to, if you don't methylate it, you make a quinone. That's like right here in the process. And then you have one more chance. You can methylate with glutathione, which is why we added a glutathione marker. And now if you don't, now you're in trouble because it's gonna rip guanine or adenine off your DNA. When you repair that, that's where the carcinogenic potential comes from. And that's why we want to look at methylation, look at glutathione. But yes, conceptually 4-methoxy matters, but it's really difficult to measure. And so far as I know, 16-methoxy is not really a thing.
Okay, so this is going to be our last question. I know this is going to be a big, broad question for you to answer, Mark, but I know you'll do a great job. Does urine testing, let's talk about Dutch testing, work well for measuring HRT when given topically?
Oh gosh. Yeah, you know that question well. Yeah, that's a half-an-hour answer, and the answer is something it's hugely important. It's a whole different lecture, but I will tell you that if I lectured 8 years ago, wait, wow, I'm getting old. If I lectured 15 years ago, sorry, I would have told you to use saliva testing because saliva testing goes really high, and there's an argument to be made that it's the most relevant measurement. And I bought into that. And over the years of digging through the literature and being counseled by people who really knew the literature that pointed me in the right direction, I finally figured out that that's not true. So the value you see in saliva is going to be higher in a relative sense than serum or urine, and it so far the data implies that it has no clinical relevance. No. So what we see in urine parallels the clinical change. So when I give you, let me move back here. Okay, so a woman starts off in the postmenopausal range, right? If I want to give you enough estrogen to move you to where this woman is at 1.6, this is actually a really nice example, I need to use the same dose of a patch or a gel that correlates with increased bone mineral density and decreased hot flashes and decreased vaginal atrophy. When it works clinically, the urine testing moves, and it moves out of the postmenopausal range. So when you get people in the range of 0.7 to 1.8, somewhere in there, that's where I point people towards for transdermal estrogen. The value that changes in the urine correlates with the change you see in the clinical picture. It makes sense and it works. For testosterone, you get the same thing, that things change in a meaningful way, but serum is more reliable. So use Dutch as a complement. When it comes to topical progesterone, you got to stay away when it comes to HRT. If you have a woman who's making progesterone, she's ovulating, but gosh, she's got PMS, whatever, you want to use topical progesterone on it, go for it. But the labs are not going to help you get the dose right. Use it, it works, don't overdo it, great, okay? It doesn't show up in urine to the degree that you expect. It doesn't show up in serum to the degree that you expect, and you get crazy numbers in saliva. The numbers in saliva, because I've mapped it out and looked at it really closely, imply that topical progesterone absorbs at 1,000%. So you put on 20 milligrams, you get a response in saliva that equates to what should be 200 milligrams if you're talking about endogenous production. So fat-soluble hormones concentrate in saliva, and they do not correlate with what goes on elsewhere. The problem with topical progesterone is one study shows that it protects the endometrium, and the other two that were well done, so there are really only 3 decent studies to look at, the other 2 show that it doesn't work. So you cannot hang your hat on topical progesterone for balancing the effects of estrogen. So in Ren's study, for example, he got low serum progesterone, high saliva progesterone, no endometrial protection. Okay, like there's no reason to use that when you're balancing estrogen. Use oral, use vaginal, and we have some materials online that can help with that. But so for topical estrogen, I would absolutely back urine testing. It works better than serum because the serum is going to go up and down. Actually, it looks a lot like this, right? It goes up for a couple hours and back down. So if you test out in here, you don't get a meaningful number. The urine tests over time. For estrogen, I love urine. For testosterone, I love serum with a urine complement. And for progesterone, I would not use it in most cases, definitely not with ERT cases. And the testing will not tell you anything that has anything to do with getting a topical progesterone dose correct. And if you go to this website right here, you can see some really nice white papers on this that are not, they're not meant to be pro-Dutch, they're just pro-information. So they'll walk through a lot of this information with you. So that's my non-short answer on that, and that's something that we'll be speaking to in other webinars. So that's, you know, that's something that I'm really passionate about getting the truth out about, because it's really complex. It's hard to go to the literature and know what's right, and you really have to do a careful job of breaking it down. And if that's the last question, super thankful that you guys hung with me. If you have any questions, we love to talk hormones, so send us an email, send me an email. If you want to test with us and you're new to us, you can always do our little starter pack. You can get up to 5 kits for half price. If you're new to us, it's a great way to just check it out. I would definitely promote doing a clinical consultation at the end of that with our team, because they're really terrific at helping you understand what does this all mean, and then what do I do about it with a particular patient. So thank you for your time, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone. Join us in February. We've got a couple webinars planned for February, so stay tuned for more information. Thank you.